Hi everyone, today I want to talk a little bit about domain level play and some thoughts I've been having regarding kind of strongholds and followers and domains and kind of characters running castles and keeps and other kind of like large institutions and how that kind of works in our game and or how I think it should work and how it kind of often doesn't. So the thing about domain level play, let's just kind of delineate some terms here. Domain level play is when player characters who usually have been playing for quite a long time, player characters and maybe even players, when they've been playing for a long time, they achieve a certain level of power, giving them access to things like mage towers or keeps and castles are the classic one, maybe a war camp if they're a barbarian, but some kind of fixed structure that allows them then to do things like recruit armies and maybe even make manufacture magic items and things like that. And the thing about domain level play is that if we look at the history of the game, at least BX, which obviously comes out in the early 80s, domain level play is kind of part and parcel of the game. It was intended that players, when they get high enough level, they would want to do these things. Like naturally, it was part of the sort of implied conceit of the early designers of D&D that player characters and players would eventually accrue enough wealth that they would naturally want to move in the direction of gaining castles, building armies, kind of putting their stamp on the world in a way that went beyond the sort of heroic fantasy trope that you get with something like Lord of the Rings, which is sort of the party saving the world, and that's them putting their stamp on the world. But actually, they would want to involve themselves in the wider politicking. Now, why do we need to talk about this? Well, to be honest with you, these rules are largely absent from modern D&D. There's nothing in 5e really. I mean, there is the dungeon furnishings kind of tables at the back for furnishing things like keeps and castles and fortresses and any type of dungeon really in the back of the DM's guide. But there isn't really anything in particular that encourages players to do this. Having said that, as a game master of, well, let me think, nearly 20 years now, this is something that players generally do want to do, I find, is that with many different groups, eventually they want to become, or someone in the group wants to get involved with running a business or running a kind of a fief of some kind. And it's up to you as the game master to kind of figure out how to do it. And I think there are a couple of ways of doing this really well, and there's a couple of ways of doing this really wrong. Now, the conceit, before we start talking about how I would go about running strongholds and domains, is that I think ludically, mechanically, from a game design perspective, strongholds and followers kind of strongholds and domains, I should say, sort of sit somewhere on a sort of a bit of a spectrum. At one end, you've got highly involved rules for recruiting, rules for measuring every single soldier that you've got, rules for mapping out like sections of wall, like, okay, it's this amount of gold to build this amount of like kind of like stone wall and this amount for a kind of tower and this amount for the furnishings in each of the rooms of the keep. And in many ways, the problem with this, and this is actually the traditional way that it's done, where it does appear in D&D. If you look in things like Old School Essentials, it is done like this. It's kind of like very sort of specific, not abstracted at all. And actually, what happens is that if you want players to play this, that becomes the game because you need them involved. The problem is that it doesn't sit couched. So while they get to kind of decide, I don't know how big their moat's going to be in feet, there isn't structures within games like that, like Old School Essentials. There isn't structures for timekeeping. There isn't kind of like how much you can build in what amount of time usually. And what happens is you need players to be really signed up for this highly mechanized version of strongholds and domains. And this is something that certain games do really well. I know I've never played it, I've never even read it, but I hear good things about Adventure Conqueror King, which has just reached its second edition, which is that's the game. It's about running kind of domains and kingdoms and that sort of thing. But everyone has to be involved with the conceit of doing that. Everyone has to agree that that is what the game's becoming, or that is the campaign you're going to run. Because otherwise, you're going to end up with a lot of dissatisfied players. Because on the main, players sign up to do heroic fantasy, like party-based, like adventuring, and they're not actually probably many of them, even if not all of them, it's going to be a problem, right? They're not that interested in counting out how many like horses are in their stable, for example. So that's one end, the highly mechanized, highly structured game that kind of becomes its own. It's not a subsystem; it becomes its own system. The other end, I find, is actually probably less satisfying, which is where strongholds and domains become sort of just accessories for player characters. So they give them, I would say, kind of slightly narrative buffs for having that seem a little bit, I would say, from the point of, I don't want to say realism, but verisimilitude, they feel a little bit disconnected from what they're actually kind of like supposed to be doing in the fiction. So, like if a character owns a castle, do they get an attack bonus? Well, I don't see why they would, but it's just a kind of sort of, it's like another piece of equipment of the characters that they can mark on their sheet that they own this, and it gives them this. This is largely, I think, how Matt Colville's Stronghold and Followers book does this. I have read this, and I've never used it. It's an expansion for a third-party supplement for 5e that adds strongholds and domains. But I think it does this. It reduces it too much to the idea of accessory. So at one end, we've got like new system, and at the other end, we've got accessory. And it's like, okay, so we're trying to find a balance where the players feel like they're making meaningful choices. It's not replacing the game unless they want it to. And it's also kind of like is involved enough that it doesn't just feel like another type of equipment. So I think if you're going to do that, to make sure it's not over or underwritten or over or under involved, you really have to do a couple of things. I think firstly, you want domains, when they become accessible, you want a variety of domains to become accessible to a variety of character types. So, for example, I think, druids and elves need access to groves. I think fighters and barbarians need to gain access to castles. I think these things help reinforce the fiction. I also believe that you need, the same could be applied to wizards, for example, wizard towers or sorcerers towers, and how these things interact. And you do need a subsystem written for this. I just don't think that you can ad hoc this on the fly. And when I've tried to do that in the past, to be honest with you, it just doesn't really work. And I find myself having to sort of come up with systems. And that's effectively what I've done. The other thing that you need in a system for running strongholds and domains is, as I said before, timekeeping. You need some way of tracking how much time it's going to take to build something, to hire someone, how much can be built, how much can be hired in a certain amount of time. And I think that the best way to do this is to actually kind of have a kind of round that's like a stronghold round that takes up X number of months. And in that, you can start to decide how long each thing's going to take to be built. And it becomes a decision then, because we're moving our players constantly in the direction of decisions. I've talked about this before when I've done my kind of like 5 top game mastery tips. If you click in the top right now, you'll see it. I'm always talking about what is, we're moving in the direction of putting the players at the next decision point. And they're, two things that need to be considered. The third thing that I think needs to be considered when running games on this kind of scale, running domain level play, as we call it, is that there needs to be some mechanical way of different strongholds, different institutions, right? It might be that the players are all running businesses, for example, or they're all running like guild halls, or they're all running universities that compete with each other, or bandit colleges. That's a good example. There needs to be some way for these things to mechanically interact. Again, we want to make sure that the interactions between domains and strongholds, etc., and similar kind of like things, and not just ad hoc. It's not just the game master sort of making it up, because what that does is it lowers the meaningfulness of it, and players can kind of sense when they're bumping up against the mechanical framework or lack thereof of your world, and that can make domain level play really unsatisfying. That's usually when it becomes boring. Now, I often think that a game that gets this really right is not actually a tabletop role-playing game. I think the game that gets domain level play perfect, in my opinion, is a really old video game, which I imagine, if you're my age, you probably have played, which is Heroes of Might and Magic, specifically Heroes of Might and Magic 3. Now, in that game, the player chooses a kind of stronghold type, chooses a fortress type, right? They can be kind of like, they can play a castle, or they can choose to be a stronghold, or they can choose to be a fortress or a dungeon. And then what happens is the player basically, it's a turn-based strategy game where players each round can build one thing, whatever that thing is. They can build one thing, and one turn equals a week in game time. And what happens is they have these kind of like backgrounds that represent their stronghold that become filled up with different icons representing the buildings. And each of the buildings that you can purchase in that game serve a really specific function. They give you access to new units, or they improve the units you've already got, or they give you access to different spells. I think this is a really good way of doing it. And I would say that when I came to design my own stronghold and domain rules, this was probably the singular biggest ludic influence that I can kind of state, because that's what we want. We want decisions to be being made, but we don't want it to be overly specific. And we want it to be kind of kept within time, and we want all of the buildings to serve a particular function. Now, about sort of 3 weeks ago, I released Advanced Fantasy, which is a supplement for my own system, Journeyman Expert Master, and it includes domain rules, specifically domain rules for in fantasy games. And in Advanced Fantasy, the players usually play characters can gain access to domains, so can gain access to strongholds when they reach about 8th or 9th level, depending on their class and depending on the kind of stronghold they're trying to gain access to. And I make a delineation between strongholds, which are physical places such as a wizard tower or a fortress, and a domain, which is a kind of area, an area of power projected out from certain strongholds. So if your stronghold is an establishment, i.e. a business, like a guild, for example, you're not entitled to assert a domain out from that, because that doesn't make sense. Businesses don't own land, right? Unless we're like talking like 19th and 18th century, like British East India Trading Company. In general terms, businesses don't project kind of political power in the form of claiming land. If you wanted to do that in that game, then you need to be in charge of something like a castle, a fortress, citadel, I call it. Or you need to be in charge of a druid grove, for example. And in that system, all of the strongholds have a new 5 set of core abilities. So player characters have 5 core abilities. They have strength, agility, endurance, intellect, and personality. And strongholds have something similar. They have 5 ability scores, or 5 abilities, core abilities. They have might, governance, infrastructure, subterfuge, and loyalty. And then all of the upgrades that you can purchase, such as archery ranges for a castle, stables, you can buy enchanting workshops if it's a wizard's tower, and it lists how many of these you can purchase. All of them may influence these abilities, and then the number that you need to roll, just like and core ability, is based on the characters, the owners, the ruler's level. And I found that using this in the last year or so has completely sort of revolutionized my games, in terms of it has allowed a kind of abstracted mechanization of the stronghold rules. And now player characters are really interested in running their stronghold once they become high enough level. Similarly, what it also does is it uses a stronghold round. As I've mentioned, I think is a necessity. A set fixed amount of time, and you can do this in a stronghold round. A stronghold round in Journeyman Expert Master is 3 months. And in 3 months, you can purchase one asset. And unless it's a hireling, you can purchase as many of those as you want. But if it's a building, for example, or a kind of general upgrade, such as efficient administrators, for example, hirelings you can hire as many as you want, but the other types you can only build or kind of create one of those per stronghold round. And then there's also a chance of stronghold events happening where your stronghold can kind of be influenced by certain things. So if you're a druid grove, you may suffer a blight of some kind on the forest, or you may, the treants may come to life and demand a moot. If you're a citadel, you might be attacked, for example. And this means that the game master can quickly come up with sort of NPC factions that are interacting with it, and also there is a way for structuring the way player characters interact. And what has started happening in my sessions now is that I have 2 characters who joint run a druid grove. One of them is a ranger, and one of them is a druid. I have one who is a fighter, and he has a citadel. And I also have one who is a wizard, and he has a wizard's tower, and he has purchased the asset Runes of Levitation, which means that the wizard tower is flying and can move. They can't extend the domain as a result of that. And each session at the end, everyone says, "Oh, can we just do a bit of stronghold stuff? Can we do a bit of kind of like strongholds and domains?" I'm like, "Okay, yeah, should we do 1 or 2 stronghold rounds?" And it takes probably 10, 15 minutes to get through a stronghold round, and it's 3 months later. And then quite often we do one, and everyone's like, "Oh, can we just do just one more, just because I want to get this bit built, or I want to get this bit of wilderness claimed." And one thing that I'm finding is those player characters who are all level 24, so in-gem levels go up to level 30. They're really high level. They're probably in their sort of final adventure, and the region that they're in is being invaded. And one thing that's really cool is they are using their domains to recruit people, to manage kind of like local power structures, and then also raise armies to defend certain regions. And they feel like the decisions are really involved. But that only comes about if you have a really sensible structure for domain level play. Now, I'm always interested to know what other people do for domain level play. I think it's one of those things where some people ignore it. I think some people I think many times, to be perfectly honest with you, I think game masters really love it, but players don't, and therefore players don't interact with it. I'd be really interested to know if any of you have come up with your own ways of doing this. I'll put a link to Gem below, both a free version and a complete version. Even in the free version, you get loads of these stronghold rules. In fact, you get the majority of them for free. You just don't get Groves of Nature and Bad Ecologies. But you get all the others. So check that out. Let me know what you think. But otherwise, thank you for taking the time to listen. I'm Gary. I'll speak with you again soon.